Right. Hi, ladies. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alina, and I am just honored to be here with you. I'm honored to be giving this talk. It feels kind of like a big one. I don't know why. Maybe just because Ruth is one of those big Bible female characters that we talk about a lot, but I'm feeling a little nervous tonight, which is not normal for me. But yeah, I'm excuse me. Before we start, I have a very important question. Are my wings okay? Are we tucked? Are we I just remembered. I was like, "Oh no, what if I am looking crazy? We don't want that." Um, we've been talking about steel magnolias. We've been talking about women of character. Um, and I don't know about you, but I cried at my table talking about a steel magnolia that I know. But maybe that's just me. We're going to talk about tonight some more steel magnolias, but also how the Lord has worked through the circumstances of Ruth. So we're not just going to focus on the characters of Ruth and Naomi, but the circumstances kind of as a whole. So tomorrow, my baby daughter, my baby Josie, she turns 1 year old. And it's crazy to think that a year ago today, I was mere hours away from holding her in my arms. And she came into this world like we all do, right? Screaming and naked and just so needy. Babies are needy. And she needed me for everything. She needed me for warmth, for comfort, for protection, for food. And she and her sister at 1 and almost 4, they still need me so much. I am in the thick of the little years right now, and it is hard. All I have ever wanted to be is a mom. And that's really emotional for me because my mom and my mother-in-law are right there. And I really look up to both of them a lot, and I'm grateful for them. But I spent my whole life, it feels like, preparing for this job. I have always known I wanted to be a mom. I babysat. I worked in our church's nursery. I taught children's church from the youngest age that I possibly could. I spent years nannying, and I even studied education and childhood development psychology in school. I thought I was so ready to be a mom. And maybe in a lot of ways I was more ready than others. And I am grateful because the Lord granted my desire. And I'm privileged to hold my daughters because I know women who are still waiting for that gift. And I get to watch them grow. And this is the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I have found myself in these early years of motherhood in a season of deep need. I need more help. I need more sleep. I need to hear you're doing great more. I am giving so much of myself to my tiny humans to meet their needs of safety and security that I need an outside source or multiple outside sources to tell me that I'm doing okay and to help me protect my heart and peace. Perhaps you are in a season of deep need right now too. Maybe you're alone and you need companionship. Maybe your family is struggling financially and you need money. Maybe you're dealing with a difficult person in your life who keeps taking advantage of you and you need freedom. Maybe you're overwhelmed by the weight of this world and the noise from the news and you need to feel safe. Maybe you just have a lot of little things that you're juggling that all together feel like a mountain and you need relief and maybe even a nap. Even if you're not in a season of deep need right now, or if one of those circumstances doesn't apply to you, you know what it is to long for someone to take care of you and to long for a safe place to exist. But where do you turn to in your times of need? Do you turn to your friends and family for help? To books for knowledge? To yourself for resilience and toughness? To your phone for the next dopamine hit? All of these and lots of other paths are empty. They're fruitless and they yield nothing. However, like Psalm 16:5 says, Lord, you alone are my portion and my cup. You make my lot secure. In the Lord, there is a place to run that fills us up and it keeps us safe. Hopefully you know that. And if you're still learning it like I am, let me gently remind you that we can trust in the Lord to meet our needs. And when we seek security in him, he shows us overwhelming kindness. that is what our passage tonight highlights, which is our passage is like the whole of chapter 2 in Ruth. And I'm a little sorry about how long it is, but that is what our passage highlights, that the Lord shows overwhelming kindness to those who come to him for refuge. So tonight we will see how the Lord protects and provides for Naomi and Ruth through the actions of Boaz as part of his plan for this royal line of David and ultimately for the redemption of mankind. So by the time Naomi and Ruth arrive in Bethlehem, they know these needs, right? A deep sense of need, specifically for safety and provision, all too well. They have both lost their husbands. Naomi has lost her husband and both of her sons. They are grieving, and they were essentially homeless without the protection and provision of male family members. In ancient times, women were the responsibility of their husbands. Widows were the responsibility of their children, especially their sons. But childless widows had no such security. Under the Old Testament law, their only hope was to rely on the charity of their family, and if they had no family, the community. But this is the time of the judges, when, as Judges, the book of Judges says, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Even in Israel, people are not obeying God's laws. And this is evident in the fact that at the beginning of the story, Naomi and her husband Elimelech actually leave Israel and dwell in Moab and let their sons marry Moabite women. These actions are directly disobedient to God's commands in Deuteronomy to not dwell among other nations and not intermarry with them. It's possible that Naomi even believes that Elimelech and her sons were taken from her because of their direct disobedience to God. Now, we don't really know that, but we do know that she returns to Bethlehem bitter, basically giving up and ready to die, and not even sure if her own people will provide for her in the way that they should and the way that she needs. And Ruth is a Moabite. She's an outsider, but more than that, the Moabites were Israel's enemies. They weren't just ambivalent about them, they hated them as a people. The king of Moab was the one who hired the prophet Balaam to speak against the people of Israel. There's a story in Numbers 22 with an angel and a talking donkey, and if you don't know it, you should read it. But the people of Moab actually had a curse on them from God. They were excluded from the presence of the Lord for 10 generations. They were uninvited from the party. So Ruth, a Moabite, coming into the people of God would have been treated with hostility. But Ruth proves herself more godly than even some of the Israelites of that day. When her husband died, she had an out. She could have turned back to her own people, remarried another Moabite man, and gone on living her life. But she chooses a life of hardship and insecurity. I don't know about you, but 9 times out of 10, I choose comfort over difficulty, but not Ruth. She voluntarily steps into a life as a childless widow and an outcast, relying on charity for her livelihood. Why? Yes, because of her love for and her loyalty towards Naomi, but there is something else pulling her toward Israel. She hints at this in her plea to Naomi when she says, "Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God." Remember, at this point, Naomi doesn't have much faith to borrow. She's bitter and she's angry with the Lord at the outcome of her life. Ruth isn't just saying that she wants to be wherever Naomi is because she loves her. She's recognizing that a life as a childless widow with a childless window under the protection of the God of Israel is better than a future with a husband in a pagan land, even if the physical and practical circumstances of that life are harder. What faith! She sees a God who can offer her protection and provision, who can meet her needs, even though she doesn't really understand how. So from all of this context established in the first chapter of the story, we know that Naomi and Ruth are returning to Bethlehem to seek refuge in a desperate situation. Legally and culturally, Naomi and Ruth are looking for a male relative to step into their lives and provide for them. This redeemer would fill the role of a husband to Ruth, and their first child would be the legal heir to Naomi's husband's and son's inheritance. Right? This law might seem a little strange to our Western mind, but in a way it's actually a kindness to the widow. It ensures a husband to take care of her in the present and a child to take care of her in the future. The Redeemer rescues the widow from a life of poverty and meets her both in the present and in her old age. But Naomi and Ruth are unsure if a Redeemer will step forward to claim them. They have nothing. And right now, at the beginning of chapter 2, their most immediate need is for food. So Ruth volunteers to go into the fields to work and provide for them. This would have been exhausting manual labor, and it comes with the danger of being singled out for her Moabiteness and fear of assault. It's a lawless and dangerous time. She can only hope that a field owner or overseer shows her kindness and lets her glean. Luckily, or rather providentially, there is a relative of Naomi's late husband who owns a field outside Bethlehem. Verse 1 of our passage tells us that his name is Boaz. He's a worthy man. Other translations use the phrase man of standing or wealthy man. And our initial impression of him is that he's a man of high position and that he's respected. So we're going to see how God uses Boaz as an instrument for taking care of Ruth and Naomi and providing for their needs. Through Boaz, God showers his overwhelming kindness in the forms of protection, provision, and blessing. So how does God provide protection for Ruth and Naomi? It says in verse 3 that Ruth happens to come across the field that belongs to Boaz. But we know better, right? With God, nothing happens by accident, so he is guiding her to a safe place where she can work hard. It's also important to note here that Boaz isn't in the field when Ruth starts working. By the time he gets there, she's already worked half a day. Remember, the fields could be a dangerous place for a woman to work, but it sounds like Boaz's character and leadership is of such quality that he has fostered an environment of safety in his people. His workers already know to treat her well and give her space to gather for herself. And when he gets to the field, it's clear that he's also established a godly environment because he gives them a godly greeting and they respond in kind. He instructs them to let her glean freely as much as she can, and she is safe enough to work in the field even into evening, maybe later than she would have worked if she was in a different part of the field. God protects Ruth by bringing her to a safe place where she doesn't have to fear being assaulted or driven away. She's actually even invited to move in and among the workers and not merely gather on the edges like a beggar. God's overwhelming kindness keeps her safe. Now, what we're reading and what we're studying here is descriptive, not prescriptive. And some of us probably know from our own circumstances and experiences that God doesn't always keep us physically safe. If you were here for my Job talk a couple of months ago, a few years ago, I don't remember how long ago it was, but we talked about how God is in control of everything. That means that sometimes he allows hardships to happen. So what does God's protection look like in our lives? I recently had a conversation with a friend of mine talking about the hard decisions that we make as parents. And I reminded her and myself that our goal as parents isn't to remove our kids from every hardship that they will face. That doesn't help them, and that's not actually real protection. You know, well, if you know me, you know I love a definition. So let's define that word protect. Merriam-Webster defines protect as to cover or shield from exposure, injury, damage, or destruction. Notice that it doesn't say to remove the damage or destruction entirely. Protection is a battle word. It's a defensive tactic. It's not running away, but it isn't wiping out the threat either. It's taking shelter so that the damage is lessened, not that it's removed. As Christians, God's protection in our lives doesn't exclude us from the hard things. Often it includes them. But like a loving parent, his protection means that he is with us, even in and especially in difficult circumstances. Remember, Ruth wasn't excluded from hard things either. The whole premise of this story is that her husband has died and she's in poverty. But God is guiding our circumstances, just like he did for Ruth, so that one day our lives too can reveal a story that is for his glory and our good. So what about provision? How does God give provision for Ruth and Naomi? In his first interaction with Ruth, Boaz gives her access to their drinking water, and he says that she can drink from what his workers have drawn rather than having to take the time to go draw her own water from the well. Now, this is a multi-part gift because, yes, he's providing her with hydration on what probably would have been a hot day, but he's also giving her the gifts of time and inclusion. Now she doesn't need to go pull water up for herself, so she can spend more time gleaning and gathering as much food as possible. And she's not given a separate Moabites-only drinking container either. She is treated like one of his own people. She's allowed in. This is extra evident in the fact that he invites her to eat with them, a sign of hospitality and friendship. Remember, the Moabites were Israel's enemies, and Ruth would have been treated either with hostility or just completely ignored and avoided. But not Boaz. Boaz, whose mother was Rahab the prostitute, probably knew a little bit about societal rejection. He sees a young woman who, like his mother, gave up everything to seek safety in God's presence and with his people, and he invites her to his table. Boaz himself passes her food, and she eats enough to satisfy her, which is probably more than she's eaten in a while. And she has food left over, which she's able to bring home to Naomi. This is such a kindness. Boaz also gives his workers instructions to leave her extra grains as they work. So in Levitical law, there is a statute that says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. This command is a built-in provision for the poor in the law of Israel. But remember, not everyone's following the laws. So the fact that Boaz not only lets her glean, but that he tells his workers to leave her extra gleanings is a generous kindness. He's going above and beyond the law. So God uses Boaz to provide Ruth with water, time to gather as much as she can, food to sustain her and energize her, extra grain to help aid her mission, and he blesses her. God blesses her through her hard work and these gifts with an ephah of barley, which probably doesn't mean much to you because who knows what an ephah is. An ephah is a whole lot. So my grandmother is Okinawan Japanese, and so I grew up eating a lot of rice. Have you ever seen one of those industrial bags, like the 25-pound bags of rice? An ephah of barley is just under 50 pounds of rice, which is 2 of those. Ruth gathered 2 of those in one day. This is objectively impressive, but it's also really cool because this isn't just food. Israel, like much of the Middle East, runs on a barter system. Barley is currency. Ruth can now turn her harvest into food, and she can use it to trade for goods and services that she and Naomi need. God, through Boaz, gives her so much more than just the basics. He gives her generous gifts. Now, we don't use barley as currency. So what does God's provision look like for us? God loves to give us good gifts too. He gives all of humanity common graces, right? A beautiful sunrise, loving relationships, the ability to taste delicious food like shrimp and grits. There are so many things that are beautiful in the world. When God made this creation, he called it very good. And because of the fall, yes, it's broken. People hurt each other, power corrupts, and natural disasters kill thousands. Sometimes it's hard to see God's provision when the world feels heavy, isn't it? But you can talk to anybody who has done foreign missions, and they'll tell you that the hearts of Christians in other countries, especially third world countries, are some of the most joyful, thankful hearts they have ever seen. In the middle of what we would consider hard circumstances that God is not removing them from, by the way, these people have no problem seeing God's hand in provision in their lives. They thank him for everything that they have. Conversely, I spent my preteen and teen years in Northern Virginia, sandwiched between the 2 wealthiest counties in the country. I grew up with a lot of privileged and entitled kids. I probably was pretty privileged and entitled, honestly. I was 15. But these kids had everything, right? They had the best education, the best clothes, the best everything that money could buy. And some of them had absolutely no gratitude for the gifts in their lives. It was like nothing was special because everything was. I think the question to ask here is not, how does God provide for us? I think it's the wrong question to ask. Rather, let's ask, do we have the eyes to see the good gifts the Lord gives us? Do we take the little and the big graces in our lives as things we are owed? Or do we see each little moment and big joy as a sprinkle of love from a caring Father? Psalm 19 is a beautiful picture of how the good around us isn't just a gift. It says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them yet. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world." The good things are not just gifts. They're purposeful. They're signposts. They're pointing to the one who made them, the one who gives them, the creator of this world, who formed you and I with care and intention and love. How does God provide for you? I can't answer for you, but I can encourage you and join with you in asking God to open our eyes to see his hand in our lives. Now, in Psalm 19, David's meditation on the wonder of God, God's creation, it naturally leads him to a meditation on the laws of God too. A God who makes wonderful, beautiful, good things is also a trustworthy God who gives good laws. So Christians are called not just to seek the common graces that are available to everyone, but we're also called to seek the ways that God commands us to live. The Psalm says that God's law is a provision, a gift, because it revives the soul, it makes us wise, and it gives us joy. And when we do see his generous, overwhelming kindness in both the common graces and the way that he guides us through his commands, how do we respond? Psalm 19 ends by David saying, "May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." Our response to God's provision is to join with all creation in glorifying him and to make intentional choices to glorify him in the way we live our lives. So we've seen how God responds with overwhelming kindness in the forms of protection and provision. And the third way we see God's kindness in this passage poured out on Ruth and Naomi is in the blessings given, and the way we see them fulfilled. So there are two blessing prayers that are given in this chapter. The first is spoken by Boaz over Ruth in verses 11 and 12. And he says, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. How you left your father and mother and your native land, you came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you have come to take refuge." Little does Boaz know that he is already being used to fulfill that blessing. And in another 3 to 4 months, God will use him to be the answer to his own prayer for a full reward when he redeems Ruth and Naomi. And he gives Ruth a child who would not only save Elimelech's family line, but be the grandfather of King David and an ancestor of Jesus Christ. So the second blessing prayer is spoken by Naomi over Boaz in verse 20 when she says, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi's blessing is worth mentioning for two reasons. The first is because we see Boaz is blessed by all these circumstances too. He's blessed by Ruth's hardworking character, her steel magnolia loyal character, right? He receives a family, and he also becomes part of the lineage of Christ. God doesn't just use him to bring about blessings for Naomi and Ruth, but he includes him in them as well. So Naomi blesses Boaz, but she also blesses the Lord. And in this, we see a heart change in Naomi. She came back to Bethlehem bitter. She was changing her name to Mara, for as she says, the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. And now we see her beginning to see his hand at work and reminding herself that she's not been forsaken and there's hope, even though she doesn't know what the ending looks like yet. So this is a little bit of an aside, but one of my favorite things about the book of Ruth is just how much information is packed into the little details of the story. The name Naomi means pleasant, and the name Mara means bitter. And when we were talking about this chapter during Side by Side, my side-by-side partner and my friend Makara, she asked me, is it significant that her name doesn't actually change to Mara in the rest of the book? And I said, I think it is, because I had never thought about this before. But God is very specific when he changes names in the Bible, isn't he? It always means something. He changes Abram's name to Abraham, which means father of nations. He changes Jacob's name to Israel, which means one who struggles with God, and we all know that story. And in the New Testament, we see Jesus change Simon's name to Peter, the rock on which he built his church. Peter means rock, right? They're usually really obvious names. But here, even though she wants to change her own name to bitter, God continues to call Naomi pleasant. It reminds me of the Psalm 16, that her great-great-grandson would pen when he says, "The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance." And Naomi does indeed receive a beautiful inheritance. Through Ruth and Boaz's son Obed and the complicated Hebrew laws, God pours his kindness on Naomi by giving her family a future. So tonight we've seen how God gives generous gifts in protecting and providing for his people in their lives. But what makes these people worthy of God's blessing? Why them? Is it because of their actions or their character? I mean, Boaz is literally described as a worthy man. We see his character in how he treats his workers, how he speaks to and provides for Ruth and Naomi. Ruth is a persistent worker and a fiercely loyal companion. But these qualities aren't what makes them worthy of God's blessing. These things about them aren't meant to indicate how great Ruth and Boaz are. Rather, they indicate how Boaz and Ruth have made God great in their lives. Boaz upholds the law in a lawless time. He fosters godliness among his workers and all who know him. He trusts that God is who he says he is. This is faith. Ruth has no influence or wealth, right? She's a Moabite outsider, owed absolutely nothing by the Hebrew God. And yet she comes to Yahweh for refuge in a state of deep need and insecurity. And she entrusts her future to God when she could have gone anywhere else and been, in a more worldly sense, better off, right? But she chooses the Lord. This is faith. Ruth and Boaz, in different ways, they put their trust in God for his protection and provision, and he blesses their faith with his overwhelming kindness by giving them a son. But he doesn't stop there. God uses Boaz to redeem Ruth and Naomi's family, and through their line comes the line of David and ultimately Christ. And in Christ Jesus, we have the ultimate kindness given to us too. A redeemer who does more than just save a family line. Our perfect redeemer rescues us not from physical poverty, but from the brokenness of this world and ourselves. Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and we are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ." He took everything upon himself on the cross. He conquered sin and death so that we could run to him for refuge. We don't have to be worthy by ourselves because Jesus is worthy, and he makes us worthy if we come to him and admit our need. He lavishes us with the greatest gift of all, life, and life abundant. And like a mother giving her children all that they need, or like a mother bird covering her babies, he protects us. He provides for us, and he blesses us. All we need to do is run to him and seek refuge under his wings. Will you pray with me? Dear Lord, I thank you. I thank you for your goodness. I thank you for your protection and your provision, the way that you love your children. I thank you for who you are. Lord, I pray that you open our eyes to see your goodness in our lives. I pray that you open our eyes to see the way that you are with us, even when life feels so hard. I thank you for the examples of women that we have who have been these steel magnolia characters in our lives, this legacy of women who trust you, godly women who put you at the center of their lives. Lord, I pray you help us to be those women. Thank you for who you are.